alike struggled for dominance. It was in this chaotic climate that the descendants of Vikings would enter the peninsula, smash all the competition, and create one of the richest and most diverse kingdoms of the Middle Ages. Welcome to our video on the Norman conquest of southern Italy and the creation and culture of the Kingdom of Sicily. These long videos are very difficult to make, so consider liking, commenting, sharing and subscribing. It helps immensely. Or support us by heading into battle on PS5, PS4 and Xbox. Just use our link in the description to download the sponsor for this video, World of Warships Legends. Take up the ships the Normans wish they had, and engage in high-explosive online naval battles. Legends takes the World of Warships formula and refines it for console play, with maps that encourage swift and deadly action, a free-to-win model where most content can be earned for free, and a load of content only available on console, including ships, commanders, and in-game events. By collaborating with other franchises, Legends keeps adding more variety to the battles, but it's the mix of over 400 20th century naval craft that provides the meat of the mastery. Learn to use 4 classes from 11 nations over 20 maps, and customize your ships to specialize in whatever you can do best. Contribute to your team and spread the burning wrecks of your enemies across the seas. Beautiful burning wrecks they are too. But you'll need strategy as much as skill to avoid such a fate for yourself, and that's what makes World of Warships Legends so fun. Thrust, flank, conceal, deceive, these are as important as armor or firepower when it comes to battle. Overall, it's a high-end PvP experience for all player skills, and it's available for free right now. To get started, check out our link in the description. The year was 911, and the Vikings were at the height of their power. The pagan warriors asserted their influence from the Anglo-Saxon heartland to the rivers of Russia. One such Viking was Rollo, a Norse war chief whose relentless raids in the lower Seine Valley had made him the bane of the Kingdom of West Francia. To stop this destruction in his realm, Frankish King Charles the Simple offered Rollo land in return for protection against other raiders. The warlord accepted, and his followers were consolidated into the Duchy of Normandy. In time, they would become some of the most influential warriors in the history of medieval Europe. The Normans quickly assimilated, absorbing the French language and Latin Christianity. Among the other things they adapted from the Franks was a feudal system of governance, albeit with a hardy Norman flair. Fiefs in Normandy were owned primarily by armed knights, and maintained through the sword. In a small duchy with a growing population, conflicts between minor lords seeking to increase their landholdings were the norm. This constant fighting maintained the intensely martial culture of the Normans' ancestors, and this created a problem. Before long, there were more knightly warlords in Normandy fighting over land than there was land to go around. As a result, a gradual exodus took form. Much like their seafaring pagan predecessors, many young Norman knights began migrating abroad, seeking land, riches, and the glory of battle in warmer, more fertile countries. Their travels would take many itinerant warriors southwards into the heart of the Latin world. In the early 11th century, the Italian peninsula was a thoroughly divided land. By the year 1000 AD, northern Italy was controlled by the Holy Roman Emperors of Germany. Southern Italy, however, was a patchwork of petty states. Benevento, Salerno and Capua were ruled by princes of the Lombards, a Germanic people who had swept into Italy in the decades after the Gothic Wars of 554 AD. Much like the Normans, these hardy northern warriors had assimilated into the culture of their adopted homeland and had quickly become Latin-speaking Christians. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire clung on to the last of their Italian holdings in the southernmost peninsulas of Apulia and Calabria. 500 years prior, Emperor Justinian had managed to return most of Italy to the empire, but Lombard invasions in the following decades saw most of the country slip from their fingers. Further south still, the island of Sicily remained fertile and prosperous. Once having belonged to Eastern Rome, it had been conquered by the Arab Aghlabid dynasty between 831 and 965. By the 11th century, another Arab dynasty, the Kalbids, ruled it. The Normans looked upon the decentralized yet wealthy lands between Syracuse and Capua and saw boundless opportunity. In 1017, a group of Norman pilgrims was travelling through Gargano en route to the shrine of St. Michael, their warlike holy patron. There they were approached by Malus of Bari, a Lombard nobleman from Byzantine Apulia. Though ruled by the Byzantines, Apulia's populace was comprised mostly of Lombards. Malus's aim was to overthrow his Greek overlords and establish an independent domain. He entreated the Normans to join his cause, who, motivated by a thirst for battle and plunder, agreed. Malus met the Byzantines on the field of Cannae, the historic site of Hannibal Barca's legendary victory 1200 years earlier. Here, the Romans annihilated the Lombard rebels and Norman sellswords, scoring a decisive victory and ending the rebellion. This initial defeat was only a minor setback for the Normans. The Byzantine commander, Basil Boioannis, saw the Franco-Norsemen for what they were, mercenaries. Impressed by their martial prowess, he was quick to overlook their former allegiance and bribed a contingent of knights to his side, offering them command over the newly built fortress town of Troia. This was a clever gamble, for in 1022, an army led by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry II marched south to assert control over the region, only to be repulsed at Troia by Boioannis' Norman hires. The following years saw the Normans increase their prestige as the premier mercenaries of southern Italy. They were never short of employment opportunities, as the Byzantines, the Pope, the Lombard princes, and the Holy Roman Emperor constantly sought to undermine each other's influence in the region. Consequently, the Franco-Norse knights often found themselves fighting on both sides of any given conflict. This worked out well, as Normans on the winning side of a battle used their leverage as irreplaceable allies to secure the safe release of their brethren on the losing side. Of all the roaming Norman bands in Italy, the largest was commanded by the enterprising warrior Rainulf Drango. He had fought at Cannae in 1018 before coming into the service of the Prince of Capua, Pandulf IV. Pandulf was a Byzantine sympathizer, so in 1026 the Lombard was deposed through a plot devised by the Holy Roman Emperor, who installed a friendly puppet, the Duke of Teano, in his stead. Luckily for Pandulf, the Norman mercenaries he had hired turned out to be a wise investment, for they quickly intervened, and with Byzantine aid, spearheaded a reconquest of Capua to help their Lombard benefactor regain his throne. Emboldened by his victory, the newly reinstated Prince of Capua marched his armies to neighbouring Naples, where the pretender of Teano had taken refuge. The Neapolitan Duke, Sergius IV, was ill-prepared for battle, but luck was on his side. Rainulf, the commander of Pandulf's Normans, and ever the shrewd mercenary, realised that Norman dominance in Italy depended on no one ruler becoming too powerful and subjugating the others, for only through constant warfare could they stay employed. In 1029, the Normans promptly switched sides and joined Sergius, driving Pandulf back to Capua. Grateful for his salvation, Sergius granted the Normans a county, comprised of the town of Aversa and its surrounding lands. This was a thrilling development to the Northmen, who for the first time in their 15-year presence in Italy finally had a land of their own. Though nominally vassals of the Duke of Naples, the Normans of Aversa soon proved they served no one but themselves, taking advantage of the endemic rivalries in the region to change allegiances whenever it profited them. Meanwhile, a new family had entered into the peninsula. They were the Orteviles, comprised of the patriarch Tancred and 8 of his sons. These fighters would soon be regarded among the most influential Normans in Italy. In 1038, the Byzantines launched a military expedition into Muslim Sicily. This ended in disaster, and by 1041, their Lombard subjects had once again taken the opportunity to erupt into rebellion. Naturally, the perennial sellswords rode into Apulia, lances in hand, to fight with their Latin cousins. Led by William Ironarm of the Hautevils, the Normans defeated two Byzantine armies at the battles of Olivento and Montemaggiore. The elite Varangian Guard fought in service of the Byzantines, led by the legendary Norwegian prince in exile Harald Hardrada, but even they could do little against the heavy cavalry of the Norman knights. Through typical avariciousness, the Normans soon decided that instead of handing the land back to the Lombards, they would much rather simply seize it for themselves. By 1047, they had conquered a sizable chunk of Byzantine Apulia and Calabria and organized it into the Norman county of Melfi. Their land gains became legitimized through the recognition of their ally, Prince Guaimar of Salerno, and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, two parties who were surely happy to see the ever-hated Byzantines humbled. Norman rule in their Italian territories was anything but harmonious. The Franco-Norse elite employed a harsh hand on their mostly Lombard subjects, provoking rebellions in both Melfi and Cosenza. Indeed, for all the mercenary work the Normans had done in the last few decades, the primary victim had always been the common people, who had taken the brunt of their habitual pillaging. Resentment against the Norman presence in Italy was coming to a boil. Among those watching the Normans' behaviour in the south was Pope Leo IX. In 1051, he had acquired temporal control of the Duchy of Benevento, whose duke had willingly offered himself to papal rule for protection against the Normans. However, no sooner had the papacy gained this territory than it was promptly captured, naturally, by the Normans. This did not endear them to the Pope, who in 1053 personally travelled south from Rome with 700 German Swabian soldiers. From there, thousands flocked to his cause, including the Duke of Gaeta, the Prince of Benevento, and common folk from almost every Lombard principality. Piling upon this momentum were the Byzantines. Led by their Catapan Argarus, they assembled an army in the remaining Apulian territory and marched for Melfi, aiming to strike from the south while the papal forces assaulted the Norman holdings from the north. The Pope had a 6,000-strong army under his command, which was a massive number for the period, and it consisted of nearly everyone the Normans inflicted injuries upon in the last 30 years. The Normans were aware that everything they had gained in Italy was now under existential threat. Count Umfred de Hauteville mustered up all loyal levies in his Apulian realm. Robert Guiscard arrived with a contingent from Calabria, while Richard Drengot, nephew of Rainulf, arrived with soldiers from Aversa. Together, they amounted to 3,000 cavalry and 500 infantry. The Normans knew that their only hope of victory was to prevent Pope Leo from linking up with the Byzantine army, so they took the initiative and rode north to intercept the papal force. On the 17th of June 1053, the Norman host encountered their foe, camped outside the town of Civitete. The Franco-Norsemen arranged their army in 3 contingents. The heavy cavalry, led by Richard Drengot, were stationed on the right, while Robert Guiscard commanded a mix of horsemen and infantry on the left. Meanwhile, Umfred de Hauteville oversaw archers and dismounted knights in the centre. On the opposing side of the field stood over 6,000 men. A line of heavy Swabian infantry extended from the centre to the right wing of the papal army, while the left was comprised of a disorganized mob of Italian and Lombardic levies. The battle did not break out immediately. Despite outnumbering the Normans 2-1, the Pope still wished to wait for the arrival of his Eastern Roman allies. Meanwhile, there was unease within the Norman ranks, for the devoutly Catholic knights had serious misgivings about taking up arms against the supreme pontiff of the Church. To that end, they sent a delegation to the Pope, offering him their homage and making overtures for peace. This was a futile endeavour, as the Normans were only met by jeers from Leo's German soldiers, who boldly demanded that they return to the land from whence they came. Diplomacy continued through the night, but the Normans could wait no longer. With each passing moment, the Byzantine reinforcements grew closer, and lacking in provisions, they were at threat of starvation. Thus, while Leo continued to stall for a time through fruitless negotiations, the Normans launched their attack. Richard Drengot was the first to strike. His heavy cavalry barreled down upon the papal left to thundering effect. The disorganized hoi polloi of militias and rebels were simply no match against the impact of a highly trained, fully disciplined Norman cavalry charge. They broke without a fight, and Richard's knights began cutting down their enemies with ease. Meanwhile, the Swabians had begun trading volleys of arrow fire with the Company of Umfrey. Soon the German infantry marched up the hill in the centre of the battlefield, where they engaged the Norman knights in a fierce melee. Unlike their Italian counterparts, the Swabians were able warriors, wielding their two-handed swords with ferocity. For a time, they were able to hold off the Normans. Up until now, Robert Guiscard had kept his men in reserve, but seeing his brother in peril, he promptly rallied his command and charged into battle, engaging the Swabian right. Still, the Germans held their own, and it seemed like the Normans had finally met a foe able to match them in martial prowess. This stalemate was broken when Richard's right flank finally managed to detangle themselves from the disarrayed mass of Italians they'd been slaughtering and joined the fight at the centre. Overwhelmed, the Swabians knew the battle was lost. Rather than surrender, they chose to die fighting to the last man. Following their victory, the Norman host rode up to the walls of Civitete, where the Pope had taken refuge. Some sources claim that Leo surrendered himself to the Normans to prevent further bloodshed, while others assert that the townsfolk of Civitete threw him out on his rear. Either way, the Normans took him hostage and held him captive at Benevento for 9 months. When the Byzantine army heard of the papal defeat, they became thoroughly demoralized and retreated back home. Being good Catholics, the Normans treated the Pope less like a prisoner and more like an honored guest, but this hospitality came at a price. Leo IX was forced to officially recognize the Norman territory in Italy, and promised to never again take up arms against them. The Treaty of Melfi in 1059 ratified the Duchy of Apulia and Calabria as a legal polity, with Robert Guiscard de Hauteville as its duke. In less than 40 short years, the Normans had entered the sun-kissed lands of southern Italy, first as pilgrims, then as mercenaries, and finally as conquerors. Their foothold in this land was secured, and they were here to stay. By the year 1060, the Normans had stabilized their rule over northern Apulia, properly conquered Calabria, and seized a sizable chunk of Campania. By now, Duke Robert de Hauteville had properly earned his title Guiscard, the Cunning. He and his brother, Roger de Hauteville, had established themselves as the head and backbone of Norman Italy. Not content with the current extent of their conquests, the Hauteville brothers remained restless and free-spirited. Always on the lookout for more land and plunder, they would soon turn their attention towards the Strait of Messina and eye the fertile lemon fields across the narrow waters. By the mid-11th century, the Isle of Sicily had been under Muslim rule for over 150 years. It had been the Tunisian Aghlabid dynasty that had ousted the Byzantines in 830 AD, before later being subsumed by the Fatimid juggernaut. In 948, an independent emirate ruled by the Kalbids was established on the island. Sicily had flourished under Islamic purview. It was considered perhaps the wealthiest island in the Mediterranean, its climate sunny and warm, its fields rich and fertile. Its capital city, Palermo, was the second largest in all of Europe, with a massive population of 350,000 citizens. However, by 1060, not all was well on the idyllic isle. The last Kalbite emir had been assassinated in 1052, and with his death, the island fractured politically into 3 principalities, all feuding with one another for dominion over the whole realm. Present also was a sizable population of native Greek Christians, who sought greater autonomy and a co-religionist protector from across the sea. The Pope hoped that Guiscard would conquer Sicily in the name of Christendom, and made Robert Guiscard the Duke of Sicily, despite him having no control over the island. Of course, Robert needed very little convincing from his spiritual suzerain to open up the new southern frontier and attempt to conquer the rich island. The opportunity to invade Sicily came when the ruler of Syracuse, Ibn Timna, who was deeply embroiled in a blood feud with his rival, the ruler of Agrigento, Ibn Hawes, approached Roger de Hauteville in Calabria and asked for his aid. Ibn Timna had been thoroughly crushed in battle, and had finally become desperate enough to turn to the Normans for help in subduing his foe, a notion which by now everyone else in southern Italy would call a profoundly bad idea. Roger, the younger and more hot-blooded of the Hauteville brothers, jumped at this opportunity. In the winter of 1061, 150 mounted Norman knights and a handful of auxiliaries crossed the strait and landed in the hinterlands northwest of Messina. They pillaged the rich and undefended countryside before handily crushing a Muslim army that had been raised against them. Roger and his knights attacked Messina, but were driven from the city's fortified walls. They retreated to their ships, only to find that they had been scattered by a Muslim fleet. They bunkered on the stormy beach for 3 days, fending off raids from Messina, until on the 4th day their ships returned and they evacuated safely with their loot in tow. While their first foray into Sicily had been something of a misstep, the Normans now knew of the riches of the southern isle and resolved to return. In the spring of the next year, they levied another army to do just that, comprised of 2,000 infantry and 450 mounted knights, led this time by both Hauteville brothers. Knowing they would need to outmaneuver the Muslim fleet to avoid meeting a watery grave before even touching Sicilian soil, they devised a plan. Robert mustered the lion's share of his men and ships at the Rock of Scylla to divert the attention of the Muslim fleet. Indeed, as the forces of Ibn Hawes gathered on the opposite end of the strait to oppose the Norman landing, Roger had sneakily made the crossing 5 miles south with some 500 men. They prowled the countryside undetected and struck Messina from the south. Roger was dumbfounded to find that Robert's diversion had worked better than they could have ever expected. The city had been left entirely unprotected. The Normans seized it with barely a fight, and the Muslim army outside the city, realizing they were caught in a pincer, fled westwards. The Greek Christian citizens of Messina greeted the Normans as liberators and offered the conquering knights a thanksgiving service. The Hautevilles rested briefly before continuing their campaign. Soon their Muslim ally Ibn Timna attached his army to theirs, and together they marched deeper into the heart of the island. Much of eastern Sicily was loyal to Ibn Timna and did not resist the movement of his Norman allies. The town of Paterno fell quickly, and the Normans soon came upon the mountain fortress of Enna, the principal stronghold of Ibn Hawes. Knowing they could never penetrate the castle walls, the Normans set to pillaging the countryside to harass Ibn Hawes into open battle. This worked like a charm, and despite vastly outnumbering his foe, Hawes's light Arabic infantry proved no match for heavy Norman knights, who crushed their opponents in the field. Despite this great victory, Robert knew that he was overextended, and thus left the fortress untaken, consolidating his gains in northeastern Sicily, while allowing most of his soldiers to return to their families in Apulia with loot in hand. Roger, on the other hand, rode into the predominantly Greek Christian town of Troina, which welcomed him as a liberator. Here he wintered, but then he learned that one Judith of Evro had arrived in Calabria. She was the daughter of a Franco-Norman noble and was Roger's betrothed, so he returned home to marry her. However, marital bliss would soon turn into domestic turmoil. Roger was incensed with his older brother's tendency to take the lion's share of land and loot won in their campaigns. The younger Hauteville demanded titles and privileges and threatened to take them by force. Absolutely enraged by his little brother's insolence, Robert rode down to Roger's capital at Mileto and laid siege to it. Roger slipped out of his capital in disguise and into the nearby town of J.A.E. He was pursued ardently by his older brother, but the townsfolk of J.A.E., loyal to Roger, managed to capture Robert and present him to the junior de Hauteville. Roger now had a choice to make. He realized that without Robert, his political ambitions were crippled, and he loved his brother. In an almost comical fashion, the two siblings embraced one another in a teary-eyed reconciliation, naturally after Roger was promised his fair share of land and loot. A civil war had been prevented, and the conquest of Sicily could now continue. The situation in the southern isle had become decidedly more complex. Ibn Timna had been ambushed and slain while campaigning against Ibn Hawwas in northern Sicily, thereby eliminating the Normans' only local ally. This did not deter the Hautevilles, and in the summer of 1062, Roger returned to Sicily while Robert remained in Apulia to put down Byzantine-supported rebellions in the region. The Norman expeditionary force arrived back in Troina to a surprisingly chilly reception. Initially, the Greek Christians hailed the Normans as liberators, but they soon realized that the Normans were harsh overlords who took what they wanted with little regard for the law. Roger did not pick up on the tension in the city, and departed with the bulk of his army to besiege the city of Nicosia, leaving Judith behind. The local population immediately rose up in revolt, forming a riotous mob and attempting to kidnap Judith, hoping that having her as a hostage would provide them the leverage needed to force Roger to withdraw from their city. The small Norman garrison left in Troina rallied to the defense of their lady, and a fierce melee ensued across the narrow streets. From there, the situation snowballed. Roger managed to gallop back to the city in time to join the garrison, but to his dismay, he found that thousands of Muslims from the surrounding countryside had taken up arms and flooded into Troina to aid the Christian Greeks. Overwhelmed, Roger was forced to order a general retreat into Troina's citadel, where the Normans holed up and prepared to weather a siege. For 4 months they held out within the citadel, suffering through a brutally icy winter. Once again, the Normans' salvation came through sheer luck. The Saracen soldiers guarding the perimeter had taken to drinking red wine to keep themselves warm in the frigid snows. Normally forbidden from drinking alcohol by the laws of their faith, they soon proved to be quite susceptible to its intoxicating effects. Roger soon realized he could take advantage of this drunkenness, and on a chilling January night, led a foray beyond his makeshift barricades and into the open streets. One by one, they subdued the Muslim outposts, all manned by inebriated, snoozing guards. Their position now secure, they engaged the Greek and Saracen besiegers in a general melee and retook the city. By now, the Muslim rulers of Sicily had come to realize what the Byzantines and Lombards had before them. The Normans were no mere mercenaries. They were a threat to the very existence of Islamic rule on their island. Quickly, the Saracen princes set aside their differences and put up a united front against the Norman encroachment. They looked across the Mediterranean for reinforcements, and received them from the Zirid Sultan Temim, who sent a sizable army of North African Berbers to Sicily, led by his princely sons, to crush the invasion. Roger was forced to return to Calabria to retrieve more horses for his knights, having eaten most of the ones they had during the siege. In the meantime, his wife Judith proved a capable martial commander, heading the defense of Troina while bands of Normans headed out to pillage the countryside for supplies. By the time Roger returned to Sicily, a massive Muslim army had gathered at Palermo and was heading eastwards towards his position. It was a dire situation. Roger had only around 130 knights and 500 infantrymen at his disposal. He could not count for help from his older brother either, as Robert's forces were tied down fighting the Byzantines in Apulia. The Benedictine monk Malaterra claims that the Saracen army numbered up to 50,000. While this is almost certainly hyperbole, it is safe to assume the Muslims numbered at least several thousand. Unwilling to sustain another drawn-out siege, Roger dispatched his cousin Selo with a contingent of 30 knights to secure Cerami, a town 8 miles west of Troina. In June of 1063, the two forces clashed. The Muslim vanguard was the first to come upon Serlo's 30 knights, who had barred themselves within the walls of Cerami. The Muslims flung themselves upon the town walls, but were unable to dislodge their Norman foes. 3 days later, Roger finally arrived to relieve Serlo's desperate situation, just in time to come head-to-head with the bulk of the Saracen army. The vanguard regrouped and joined the main Muslim ranks. The Norman count led a cavalry charge into his enemy, but was repulsed. Following that, he had barely enough time to form a defensive line before the sheer weight of the Muslim army crashed down upon his meagre force. Despite being massively outnumbered, and against all odds, the Norman line held, with their heavy armour and knightly discipline being once more the deciding factor in battle. Serlo, meanwhile, had sallied out of Cerami, slammed into the Muslim left flank with his cavalry, and began to carve a bloody path through an ocean of lightly armoured Saracens towards his Norman comrades. As day turned to evening, Muslim morale collapsed, and they fled the field. Malaterra claims that the Normans slew over 20,000 men at Cerami, but this is once again likely an exaggeration. Nevertheless, they had won yet another highly unlikely victory. Much like how the Battle of Civitate had cemented their presence in the southern Italian mainland, the Battle of Cerami established the permanence of the Normans in Sicily. While the Normans had secured their control over the northeastern part of the island, their conquest of all Sicily was slowed exponentially in the years that followed. In 1064, both Roger and Robert mustered their levies and laid siege to Palermo, knowing that control over the immensely prosperous capital city was the only way to guarantee dominion over the whole island. During the siege, their camp was thoroughly infested by a species of venomous tarantula. Following this, the Normans made the completely and utterly reasonable decision to abandon the entire campaign. The years that followed saw Sicilian expansion delayed by wars fought on other fronts. Robert returned to Apulia to once more put down the perpetual rebellions in his domain. Without the aid of his brother's army, Roger was able to hold his Sicilian territory, but was prevented from making any significant land gains into the regions still dominated by Muslim emirs. After a few years of lull, the gears of war once more began to turn. In 1068, Roger won a decisive victory over the Muslims in an engagement outside the town of Misolmeri, which forced the Muslims of Sicily to begin turning on themselves. The Kalbids of Palermo, led by Ibn Hawis, resolved that it was the interference of the North African Zirids that had led to their demise, and led an uprising against their rule. As riots broke out in Palermo, Ibn Hawis was killed, and the Zirid princes, deciding they had lost enough in Sicily, packed up and returned to North Africa. Muslim Sicily was now leaderless and deprived of the bulk of its army. Its capital lay helpless to invasion. In the year 1071, Robert Guiscard capped off a long and grueling campaign in Apulia when he finally conquered Bari, ending the Byzantine presence in Italy once and for all. With the southern mainland firmly in Norman hands, the full might of the Franco-Norsemen could be finally rendered upon Palermo, the jewel of the Mediterranean. Indeed, the city soon fell to the combined might of the Hauteville brothers, and by 1072 was fully in Norman hands. The Islamic rump state in Sicily was given a reprieve, as the Hautevilles turned their conquering armies towards Naples, Amalfi, Salerno and Abruzzo. But by now, their fate was inevitable. Roger had been made the first Count of Sicily, the vassal of his brother, the Duke of Apulia. In 1085, he conquered Syracuse, the last great Muslim city in Sicily. In 1091, Noto, the final Islamic outpost, fell to the relentless de Hauteville, ending nearly 2 centuries of Muslim rule on the island. For the next 100 years, the borders of the Norman realm would go largely unchanged. While the region had new masters, its people remained diverse. The Normans, alongside their Orthodox Greek and Muslim Arab subjects, created perhaps the most culturally dynamic kingdom in the history of medieval Europe, a phenomenon we will explore in depth at the end of this documentary, so stay tuned. For now, the Norman conquests continue. Let us now wind back the clock by 20 years and shift our focus from the war against the Muslims to yet more Pope drama and the attempted conquest of the Greeks of Eastern Rome. Back in 1071, the Fox Guiscard had taken Bari, the last Byzantine city in Apulia, ending 500 years of Eastern Roman rule on the Italian peninsula. With their long struggle against the Greeks in Italy now over, Norman knights turned northwards for adventure, war and booty, ravaging their way through the beleaguered lands of Benevento and the Abruzzi lands under the nominal suzerainty of the Papal States. The papacy, for the most part, had maintained a stable, if uneasy, relationship with the Normans after Pope Leo IX had been humbled by them at Civitate back in 1053. But now the Franco-Norsemen were taking coin right out of the pocket of the church, and that it could not abide. When Gregory VII became the Pope in 1073, he demanded a meeting with Guiscard, and when the sly fox refused, the young Pope excommunicated him, attempting to raise an army of southern French and northern Italian princelings to wage a holy war on the Franco-Normans. However, unable to gain ample support, the Pope was forced to once more resign himself to the permanent presence of the pathologically violent knights on his southern doorstep. At the same time, the papacy was also embroiled in the escalating investiture controversy with the King of the Germans to the north, vying bitterly for political supremacy over the hierarchy of the church. Knowing full well that the ambitious young king Henry IV may well use bigger army diplomacy to settle the matter, the Pope was forced to look south for military aid. In June of 1080, Gregory VII reached an accord with Guiscard. The old duke pledged himself as a nominal vassal of the papacy, and agreed to come to the Pope's military aid if need be. In return, he was absolved of his excommunication and allowed to keep the lands he had taken from the Papal States, provided he admitted he felt really bad about it, and made an empty promise to give it back someday, maybe. With this new accord reached, it became evident that the Normans would inevitably be roped into the brewing conflict between the Pope and the German Emperor. However, that storm was still on the horizon. With his own feud with the Pope sorted, Guiscard shifted his attention eastward across the Adriatic Sea to the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire. In the late 11th century, Byzantium was a rapidly disintegrating empire. 1071 had been particularly bad for the Greeks, for in the same year the Normans kicked them out of Italy, they had also suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks at Manzikert, losing most of Anatolia in the aftermath. Recognizing his weak position, the emperor in Constantinople, Michael VII, supplicated himself to the Normans, allowing Duke Guiscard's daughter to marry his son, and paying the Franco-Norsemen an annual tribute of £200 of gold. This stability would not last, for in 1078, Michael VII was overthrown in a civil war by a usurper, Nikephoros Bourtaniatis, severing Guiscard's ties to the imperial family. The news reached the Norman Duke in 1080, when a man claiming to be Michael VII arrived at his Apulian court, beseeching Guiscard for aid in reclaiming his rightful throne. However, this man was most likely not the real Michael VII, who had since become a monk in the Constantinople monastery of St. John. Sources conflict on whether or not this imperial impostor was a rogue seeking to con his way into imperial riches, or simply a ringer working for Guiscard, who needed the pretext to invade the east. The latter seems more likely, as the old fox had been eyeing the Byzantine Balkans with hungry eyes for years, and the deposition of Michael VII was all the casus belli he needed to launch an invasion. In 1081, the gears of conquest began to turn. At the turn of the spring campaigning season, Guiscard began to rally ships and levies off the ports of Taranto and Otranto, all the while claiming his mission was to restore the fake Michael. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, another military coup had seen the deposition of the usurper Nikephoros and the ascension of the young general Alexios Komnenos to the imperial throne. In time, Alexios would prove himself to be one of the greatest emperors of Eastern Rome, and the coming war between him and the old fox Guiscard would be one of the most formidable showdowns in medieval history. Sources differ wildly on the size of the Norman invasion force, but it probably came up to 700 elite heavy knights and 15,000 light cavalry, conscript infantry, and crossbowmen. They sailed across the Adriatic in Byzantine-style Kilandia ships, equipped with ramps capable of unloading horses directly onto the shore, enabling quick land-to-sea mobilization of the deadly Norman cavalry. Guiscard sent his son, Bohemond, ahead of the main fleet with 15 ships. The vanguard captured the towns of Aulon and Oricum with little trouble, but found itself unable to crack the ardent citadel on the Isle of Corfu. On May 21st, Guiscard arrived with the main fleet, and Corfu soon fell. Having established their footholds on the Balkan coast, the detachments of the Norman army then coalesced at Aulon, from where they intended to strike north at the fortress of Dyrrhachium. This was an ancient institution on the Adriatic coast, famous for being the site of a battle between the forces of Caesar and Pompey in 48 BC. 1,000 years later, it served as the main bastion of Eastern Roman power in the Western Balkans. Situated on a long, narrow peninsula cut off from the mainland by thick, swampy marshlands, it was a tough nut to crack. Nevertheless, if it was taken, the dominoes of Byzantine defense would collapse, allowing the Normans to strike into the heart of Greece, and then perhaps across the Aegean into Constantinople itself. The Norman approach was hardly smooth. As Guiscard sailed up the coast, a good chunk of his fleet was lost to a storm. Thankfully, the bulk of the army had been travelling by land, and the campaign pushed on. On the 17th of June, the Normans had arrived outside the walls of Dyrrhachium, setting up camp in the ruins of an old Roman town in its immediate hinterland. Meanwhile, the shrewd Emperor Alexios had not been idle. Realizing his own western navy was ill-equipped to stop the Normans' naval advance, he called upon his ally for aid, the Maritime Republic of Venice. Formerly a vassal of Byzantium, the Serene Republic was functionally an independent merchant empire on the rise, motivated principally by the pragmatisms of gold. However, the ambitious Normans proved a threat to Venetian trade hegemony in the Adriatic Sea, and thus, Doge Dominica Selvo agreed to aid the Byzantine cause, dispatching a fleet of warships southwards to confront the Norman fleet, which was now blockading Dyrrhachium by sea. Soon, the battle on land was joined. Guiscard's forces constructed helepolis, large Byzantine-style siege towers, and with them attempted to storm the north and eastern sides of the citadel. They were repeatedly repulsed by outward sorties of Dyrrhachium's defenders, who managed to burn down the siegecraft. For a while, the contest seemed deadlocked. This changed in late July, when the Venetians finally arrived to relieve their Greek allies. The Normans, lacking the naval acumen of their Viking ancestors, were not a match for the seasoned Venetian fleet. Accounts of this maritime skirmish differ wildly between Latin and Greek sources, but it seems likely that the Venetian fleet formed an impenetrable crescent-like formation known as Pelagolimon, and sprayed Greek fire upon the Norman fleet, routing it in a baptism of chaos and flame. It was a devastating blow to Guiscard. With his ships scattered or destroyed, the Byzantines and Venetians dominated the Adriatic Sea, cutting off his supply lines from Italy. With no more provisions coming from Apulia, and stuck in the thick, humid climate of southern Illyria, starvation and disease had begun to spread through the landward Norman camp. Meanwhile, by August, the warrior Emperor Alexios had set off from Constantinople to destroy the Normans once and for all. His army was an unlikely coalition of the Byzantines' past enemies turned allies, including Armenians, Turks, Frankish mercenaries, the Tagmatas of Thrace and Macedon, and a Serbian contingent led by their king, Constantine Bodin. Most notable in the Byzantine expedition was the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Norse and Anglo-Saxon warriors and the cream of the Eastern Roman army. All told, they amounted to anywhere between 18,000 to 20,000 souls. Following the old Roman road of Via Egnatia, Alexios' army arrived at Dyrrhachium on the 15th of October, setting up his camp on the seaward side of the wide lagoon north of the citadel. Within Alexios' war council, there were two contrasting views. The governor of Dyrrhachium and the more experienced officers cautioned for a more conservative strategy. After all, their enemy was isolated and starving, and by blockading their camp and doing guerrilla-style raids, they could grind them down into nothing. However, the younger, more hot-headed generals demanded an immediate full-scale pitched battle, predicated on honor and pride. The latter won out, so on October 17th, the Byzantine army marched en masse back across the lagoon, circling southwards to strike the Norman camp from the east. Realizing that the final battle was nigh, Guiscard ordered his remaining ships to be burned. The old fox's message to his troops was clear. There was no turning back. They would fight until the end. Under the cover of night, Guiscard moved his troops up to the sanctuary of St. Theodorus, where he organized his army into three contingents. The left wing, led by Bohemond, the right wing, led by a knight named Amicetus, and the center, led by the old fox himself. The two wings were composed of conscripted levies and light cavalry, while the elite Norman knights were concentrated in the center. When the sun rose on the morning of October 18th, Alexios saw his Norman foes lined up before him. Like Guiscard, the warrior emperor arranged his army into three contingents and took personal command of the center company. Notably, however, he deployed his Varangians as a vanguard a few yards ahead of his main army lines, hoping their mastery as heavy shock troopers could absorb a Norman cavalry charge. Many of the Anglo-Saxons were veterans of Hastings in 1066. They had been driven out of their homeland by the usurper King William and longed for vengeance against his Norman cousins in the south. The stare-down came to a jarring end when Guiscard deployed a contingent of light cavalry from his center out to harass the Varangian vanguard, attempting to break their tight formation. The Englishmen held firm, while the light archers and peltasts in the Byzantine lines advanced, hurling their missiles at their foe to keep the knights at bay. Meanwhile, the rest of the Norman line had begun a slow advance. On the Byzantine side of the field, the Serbians and Turks kept their troops in reserve at the back of the line. Their loyalty to the Greek emperor was dubious, and they wanted to see who had the upper hand before joining the fight. Soon, Amicetus's right division charged forward, smashing into the Varangians' left flank. However, the Saxons held firm, and together with the Eastern Roman left and elements of Alexios' centre company, routed the Norman light cavalry and conscripts, sending them fleeing to the shore. Meanwhile, the Norman light infantry in the centre and left had engaged in a general melee with the Byzantine centre and right, with neither side giving any ground. It is here the battle reached a critical junction. The Varangians, swelling with confidence and after repelling the initial Norman charge, barreled after their fleeing foe. This bloodlust would cost them their lives, for as they pursued the Norman right, they became separated from the main Byzantine lines, making them vulnerable to flanking. Guiscard wasted no time. Seeing the jugular exposed, he sent a contingent of spearmen and crossbowmen from his centre to peel off from the melee and strike at the Varangians' left flank. The Saxons, exhausted, were taken completely by surprise, and their ranks were devastated. Those who survived fled up a hill to the nearby Church of St. Michael, where they boarded themselves up for protection. The Normans, in a stroke of poetic irony, set the church of their own patron saint ablaze, committing every Varangian within to a fiery death. The annihilation of the Varangians was a death blow to Byzantine morale. The Turks and Serbians, thus far kept in reserve, peeled off from the Roman army, with some 7,000 soldiers abandoning the fight. Emperor Alexios ardently fought on with what remained of his forces, but his was now a doomed struggle. Guiscard, who had previously kept his elite knights in reserve, now ordered a full cavalry charge into the Byzantine line. Whatever was left of Roman morale shattered, and their troops were slaughtered or routed off the field. During this flight, Emperor Alexios was waylaid by Amicetus and his right wing, seeking to redeem their tarnished honour from being routed earlier. The Greek emperor managed to fight them off, however, while sustaining injuries. He escaped and fled to Ohrid, where he desperately began mounting a new line of defence. The Battle of Dyrrhachium exacted a heavy toll on both sides. The Byzantines suffered 5,000 men dead, while Norman losses were unknown but heavy. The siege of the fortress itself continued for another 4 months, until February of 1082, when an Italian citizen within the walls opened the gates for the Normans, allowing Guiscard to finally conquer the stubborn citadel. For Alexios, the situation was incredibly dire. Emptying out the imperial coffers, the desperate emperor offered 360,000 gold pieces to Henry IV, the King of the Germans, with a plea to invade the Papal States, the Normans' suzerain and ally. By doing this, he hoped Robert Guiscard would be forced to divert his troops back to Italy, giving the Byzantines some reprieve from his invasion. Henry, for his part, was still deeply embroiled in the investiture controversy with the Pope, and therefore was all too happy to take Alexios' exorbitant tribute and invade his biggest rival.
Marching down the Italian peninsula, the German king soon bore his might down upon the city of Rome. To further compound matters, Guiscard's own vassals back in Apulia had risen up against him in his absence, no doubt spurred on by Byzantine whispers and silver. In the months following the fall of Dyrrhachium, Guiscard and his armies marched eastwards, taking the city of Castoria with ease, where they rested and prepared an offensive on Alexios' temporary base of Thessaloniki. In April, word of the brewing revolts in Apulia reached Duke Robert, and the old warlord hastily departed back home to quell the rebellion, setting the stage for the coming contest between his cunning but hitherto untested son, Bohemond, and the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who, despite being bloodied, was not ready to throw in the towel.
Surprisingly,
Bohemon's first course of action was not to strike at Thessaloniki as his father had planned, but to take his troops and march southwest to the capital of Epirus, Ioannina. On his way through Thessaly, he found his army supplemented by the local Vlachs, a collection of peoples who existed in pockets throughout the Balkans. These Aromanians, as they were also known, had been chafing under the heavy taxation and corrupt bureaucracy of the Byzantine Empire for decades, and saw common cause with the Normans. By the end of April, Bohemon's army had reached Ioannina. The city quickly surrendered to spare itself from the ruthless pillaging that the Normans were infamous for. Bohemond spent the next few months fortifying its defences. Meanwhile, Alexios had retreated to Constantinople, where he had managed to scrape together another new army despite depleted resources. The total size of this army is lost to history, but it likely outnumbered Bohemond's expeditionary force. Sometime in the summer, Alexios' host had arrived in the hinterlands just outside Ioannina. The shrewd emperor had learned from his loss at Dyrrhachium. To counteract the thundering impact of a Norman cavalry charge, he had a squadron of light chariots hidden behind a front line of infantry, with riders hiding beneath the vehicles. The plan was to lead the Normans into believing that the Byzantines were a primarily foot soldier-based army, prompting them to commit to a full-scale charge. When the enemy knights came within striking distance, the front line would split and the riders would rush onto their chariots, using their superior mobility to outmaneuver, flank, and destroy. This, however, would never come to pass. Bohemond evidently had learned of the Greeks' plans beforehand, and responded by simply dividing his cavalry into two wings, charging into the Byzantine forces' left and right flank to catch them in a pincer movement, rendering them unable to maneuver around them. Caught entirely by surprise, most of Alexios' army fled the field, while many were slaughtered in a brutal melee. Ioannina remained in Norman hands. Humiliated once more, Alexios limped back to Thessaloniki, where he consolidated what remained of his levies, all the while confiscating the treasures of the Orthodox Church. This was deeply unpopular with the clergy, but it allowed the emperor to replenish his army with mercenaries. Bohemond, meanwhile, had marched his victorious forces southwards to the city of Arta, which he laid siege to. Just like Dyrrhachium and Ioannina, Alexios marched once more to relieve the latest city that had fallen into Norman clutches. Once more he predicted a full frontal cavalry charge, and this time laid a perimeter of caltrops hidden in the tall grass a ways ahead of his front line. His plan was to use the traps to pierce the Norman horses' flesh, throwing them into chaos, at which point the Byzantine light cavalry, situated on the wings, would charge into their left and right flank. Bohemond, however, was of a simpler mind. Deciding to simply use what had worked before, he once more divided his knights into a left and right wing, barreling into the Byzantine forces in a pincer yet again, bypassing the caltrops, which had only been laid before the front lines. Furthermore, Alexios had not accounted for his army's low morale. Terrified of the Normans, who thus far had made mincemeat of them in every battle they fought, the Greeks and their mercenaries either fled the field or were slaughtered. Seeing yet another battle lost, Alexios fled back to Constantinople. With Alexios stuck licking his wounds in the capital, Bohemond took the initiative and advanced northeast, subduing the city of Skopje and the surrounding towns before marching back south to Castoria by mid-autumn. With the weather turning bleak, the young Norman warlord had to make a choice: settle in for the winter or continue his advance. Knowing the climate of Western Macedonia to be chilly and damp, and not wanting to risk sickness spreading through his army, Bohemond decided to push southeast to the sunny, fertile plains of Thessaly. To that end, the Norman knights pointed their lances at the region's capital, the city of Larissa. If Byzantine sources are to be believed, the Franco-Norsemen appeared before the walls of Larissa on November 3rd, laying siege to the city and cutting it off from the outside world. The city defense was headed by a veteran soldier named Leocephalus, who remained ardently loyal to his emperor in Constantinople. Leo defiantly held out against Bohemond for over 6 months, but as winter turned to spring, morale in the city began to plummet as the Larissans starved under the Norman blockade. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexios, predictably, had not yet given up. Despite suffering crushing loss after crushing loss, the remarkably stubborn Roman would not turn his back on his dying empire. First, he resorted to diplomacy. Using the same underhanded tactics that had sent Guiscard rushing back to Italy, he found a way to spread whispers into the Norman camp, lighting the fires of conspiracy. 3 senior generals in the Norman army, Peter of Ulp and 2 men named Reinaldus and William, were accused by the rest of the Franco-Norsemen of scheming to defect to the Byzantines. This created a rift within Bohemond's leadership corps, no doubt dealing a blow to Norman morale and buying Alexios some time. Meanwhile, using what remained of Byzantine coffers and confiscated church artifacts, Alexios managed to purchase for himself a mercenary army of 7,000 Seljuk Turks, loaned to him by the Rum Sultan Suleiman I. Despite being the recent enemies of the Eastern Romans, it can be surmised that the Turks had a vested interest in ensuring that an army of zealous Latin knights did not advance right onto their doorstep. In March of 1083, Alexios began his westward march for one final decisive battle with the Normans. Joined by Greek levies from Thessaloniki and some Pecheneg sellswords on the way, he passed his army through the narrow Tempe Valley and via the river Peneus, making his camp in the town of Trikala, where he began formulating his plan of attack. With each defeat, Alexios had adapted his strategy, and this time was no different. He knew that his troops were comparatively low in experience and morale compared to the veteran, battle-hardened Norman knights, and that therefore any direct confrontation with the Latin enemy would result in yet another crushing loss. To that end, he apprehended a local Thessalian farmer and had him educate his generals on every detail of the local terrain, with the intention of planning an ambush. On a sunny summer's morning, sometime in July of 1083, a line of Byzantine soldiers appeared on the plains of Larissa's eastern approach. Led by the generals Nicephorus Melicinus and Basil Curticius, their imperial banners flew proudly, challenging the Normans to fight. Believing the flags to represent the main Roman army, Bohemond immediately ordered his knights to mount up. With himself at the head of one squadron, and his trusted officer Brienne at the other, they barreled down in a full frontal cavalry charge upon the Byzantine line. This time, however, would not be like the others. Instead of engaging in a general melee, the Byzantines began a planned retreat to a place called Lycostomion, the Wolf's Mouth. It was here Alexios' genius finally pulled through. Setting his ambush into action, the Greek emperor ordered a contingent of mounted archers and peltasts to begin harassing the charging Norman knights from the flank, prompting them to break their pursuit. This worked like a charm, as Count Brienne peeled off his squadron of knights to charge at his harassers. Unfortunately for him, the Normans' heavy cavalry proved unable to outmaneuver the likely Turkic mounted archers, who circled around them with ease, shooting out the horses from under the Latin knights and raining chaos upon them. Brienne made a desperate attempt to call for reinforcements, but he had been separated from Bohemond's squadron, and communication lines had been cut. Meanwhile, Bohemond himself had broken off his pursuit of the Byzantine decoy army and made a temporary camp on a small river island called Salabria, a narrow region of the outskirts of Larissa defined by marshy swamplands. According to Byzantine sources, Bohemond did not take his situation very seriously, reportedly having been lounging around eating grapes. Sometime later, Brienne's squadron had likely managed to link back up with Bohemond, and their ragged, wounded state alerted the young Norman duke to the reality of the threat he faced. The next morning,
Alexios bore the full might of his army down upon Bohemon's camp. His Turkic and Pecheneg horse archers circled around the narrow marshlands, peppering the heavily armoured knights with arrows in an attempt to draw them out of their camp and expose themselves. Learning from Brienne's mistake, Bohemond did not take the bait, ordering his warriors to remain dismounted and to form a phalanx with their lances and shields, turtling down to protect themselves from the missiles. Pinned down and trapped, it was clear that Alexios finally had the upper hand. The contest was decided when a stray arrow struck Bohemond's standard-bearer, causing the Normans to panic, break formation, and flee westwards to Trikala. Finally, it was Alexios who saw the Normans' jugular exposed, and he went all in to end their campaign for good. Having sowed the seeds of division in the Norman ranks even before the battle, and knowing now that defeat would have shattered their morale further, Alexios promised lavish gifts and high court titles to any Norman noble who would desert Bohemond and join him. Bohemond found himself unable to match Alexios' extravagant offers, nor was he even able to pay his soldiers for the 2.5 years of campaigning they had done in the Balkans. Fearing a total mutiny in his army, he was forced to retreat back across the Adriatic, abandoning the lands he had taken in Macedonia and Thessaly to be reconquered by the Eastern Roman Empire. Larissa proved to be a great victory for Alexios, but the emperor was not done yet. He called the Venetians back into action, who surprisingly had remained loyal to Byzantium throughout this whole ordeal. Spurred on with the promise of trade concessions and a colony in Constantinople, the Italian sea lords took to their warships once more, driving the Normans out of Dyrrhachium and Corfu, returning those territories to the Greeks. The Balkan campaign was over. Despite the best efforts of the fearsome Norman knights, the shrewd and practical policies of the Komnenian emperor had won the day and saved the Eastern Roman Empire from total destruction. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Robert Guiscard had little time to process his son's defeat in the east, too busy dealing with the chaos Alexios had created for him on his home turf. He spent 15 months quelling the rebellions in Apulia, before finally marching north with an army of at least 4,000 to aid his spiritual suzerain in Rome. For Pope Gregory, the situation was desperate. The German king Henry had more or less taken full control of the Eternal City, leaving the Pope confined in the Castel Sant'Angelo. An anti-pope, Clement III, had been coronated in St. Peter's Basilica at the behest of the king, and in turn had crowned Henry with the symbolic title of Charlemagne, Holy Roman Emperor. Upon hearing that Guiscard was marching to face him, Henry opted to avoid open battle, seeing no need for it. After all, he'd gotten everything he wanted. Perhaps also fearing the martial prowess of the Normans, he and his army retreated back to Germany. When Guiscard arrived at the gates of Rome in 1084, he had expected to be treated like a liberator. Instead, to his unpleasant surprise, he found himself barred by an angry Roman populace who had thrown their support behind Emperor Henry rather than the Pope, who remained hidden in his castle. Naturally, the old warlord was undeterred by this mob and formulated a plan to break through their defences. The bulk of his army remained camped outside the east side of the city, where they skirmished sporadically with the Romans on the walls. Meanwhile, under cover of darkness, he snuck 1,400 men around the walls to the Porta Latina, a small, sparsely defended gate. Shrouded by night, they scaled the battlements and opened the portcullis for the rest of the army, which poured into the city, taking the Romans completely by surprise. From here, sources differ wildly on what happened next. Roman chroniclers bitterly claim that Guiscard's troops committed a brutal and ruthless sacking, slaughtering and violating indiscriminately, while Norman chroniclers assert that Guiscard simply set some buildings aflame to distract the Romans, used it to rescue the Pope, then left the city. It seems most likely that the Normans ravaged their way through the capital and Palatine hills, looting and pillaging as they had done for years,
while burning 8 churches in the process. However, the damage was nowhere near what Rome had seen from its sacks of yore under the Gauls or the Goths. Having lost most of his support, and reviled by the citizens of Rome for his role in the Norman sacking, Pope Gregory was forced into exile in Norman Benevento, where he died a year later. Meanwhile, the Germans' imperial antipope Clement retained power as Christendom's supreme pontiff. As for Guiscard, following his little side quest of sacking the heart of the Catholic world, he set about returning to the main story mission, but his attempt to pick up where he'd left off in Byzantium would end before it truly began. In May of 1085, while rallying his troops on the Greek island of Kephallonia, he succumbed to a disease. Frail and sickly, he passed peacefully in his bed, ending the 4-decade-long career of one of the most successful medieval warriors of all time. The attempted Norman conquest of the Balkans became a watershed moment for the Eastern Roman Empire. In his darkest hour, the shrewd and cunning Emperor Alexios was tested in fire and blood, and during the rest of his enlightened reign, the borders of his empire were secured. Over the next century, his dynasty, the Komnenoi, would retake much of the Balkans and Anatolia, breathing new life into a long-struggling imperium. The death of the cunning fox Guiscard marked the end of an era for the Normans of the south. The warlord and his de Hauteville clan had cemented their permanent legacy, and although they had failed to conquer the east, southern Italy and Sicily remained firmly in their control, and neither Greeks, Germans or popes would be able to dislodge them from this land.
We will now take a break from the endless march of warfare and ask our audience to contemplate the following words. Here lies Anna, the mother of the priest Grisandus, priest of the royal, sovereign, excellent, magnanimous, veneered, splendid Saint Majesty, and benign, strong for God's grace, stable for the divine will that reigns on Italy, Lombardy, Calabria, Sicily, and Africa. These words were originally inscribed in Arabic on the tombstone of a Norman noblewoman in Sicily, a tombstone that also featured epitaphs in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, a symbol of multiculturalism at the crossroads of the medieval world. Thus far in this documentary, we have covered the Norman conquests in southern Italy. In this part, we will see the culmination of their efforts, examining how a collection of warlike duchies became one of the richest, most politically sophisticated and multicultural kingdoms in medieval Europe. After Robert and Beaumont failed to conquer the Byzantine Empire, an opportunity to go adventuring again came with a little event known as the First Crusade, where Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos was surely surprised to see Duke Beaumont at the gates of Constantinople in 1095 AD, not to destroy his empire as he had nearly done so 10 years prior, but to help the Byzantines fight the Seljuk Turks. The Norman participation in the First Crusade was so successful that Duke Beaumont soon became Prince Beaumont of the Principality of Antioch. Check out our videos on the First Crusade to learn more about these events.
Meanwhile, back west,